Now, you are a very difficult audience, you see, because I do quite a lot of public speaking. I have this quite well sorted out. Because normally I get invited to a group of people that might be, for example, very capable business people. And what I do is I stand up and I immediately start talking about sparse Bayesian analysis and singular value decomposition over multi-dimensional spaces. And of course, I'm on safe ground. No problems. Now, having seen some of the faces in here, who I realise have neurons that are younger than mine and have not been abused at the same level, that's dangerous territory. Fine. I always have plan B, which is in those situations, I talk about business and operating margin and free cash flow and all those sort of things, and I get away with that. And of course, the problem is I look at the audience here today, and we have various people connected to the computer lab who have done all the sort of wonderful companies that we see over there. So we're in a bit of a problem today. We're going to have to sort of try and stay in the middle. If it gets really bad, I'll start just making sort of general philosophical statements and a bit of interpretive dance, and we'll see if we can get away with it. So we'll take it from there. What we're going to do really today is try and talk about how technology meets the commercial world and the transition from research to actually having impact out there. One of the big difficulties with this slide was we were putting together this slide in the office, and every time someone walked past, they had another name to add. And you can see from the scroll there, so if anyone's been left off, please don't be offended, but we kind of gave up at a point. One of the interesting things, though, I think about this slide is that you have some of the companies that obviously have a direct lineage from the computer lab, but when you actually know what goes on in some of the other companies, so like Solexa, they could not have happened without the cluster of know-how that is around here. And so what we're talking about here is an effect which ripples out from the computer lab, certainly through the Cambridge cluster, crosses over disciplines and out through the rest of the UK, and of course has changed the world. So let's go back in time. That's a little bit earlier than my undergraduate days. And what I wanted to do really was tell you about my experience. The reality of these things is a bit like creatures in the animal kingdom. There's all sorts of niches and ways of doing things, and so there's no generalization that is valid. But all I can do really is talk to my story, so that's what I'm going to do. So I came up to Cambridge, I arrived in 1983. And the important thing just to state is it was absolutely inconceivable in 1983 to imagine the world that we are living in now from a technology point of view. We forget that, and my wonderful 22-year-old that I work with now can't believe it was ever not as it is now. But you know, the ability to process, store, or transmit information was massively limited. There weren't mobile phones, for example. And so there's been an absolute stunning change and a period of change through then, and that's thrown up much opportunity. And the question is, can we learn things from that period in order to try and understand what's happening in the future? Well, I ended up getting into all of this due to this device. This is a 6502-based computer, BBC Micro. Now, one of the interesting things is I've been working on a report for the UK government recently on the importance to the economy of data and algorithms and modelling. And I've had the wonderful thing of going around meeting lots of eminent people in all sorts of areas where those subjects impact what they're doing. And almost without fail, the BBC Micro turns out to have been a key point in those people's transition to what they're doing now. So one of the interesting things is that this is an example of a catalyst which had a change in the country that was way beyond what was predicted or understood at the time. Now, the great thing about this machine was this was one of these machines where you could understand everything about it. They actually sent you a circuit diagram with the manual. And you could go in, and there were commands, some of you may remember, like poke and peek, and you could see each memory location and write to registers on chips and everything. And it was a great training in understanding the principles that go into thinking about technology's problem solving. But you know, I had an even stronger driver. And that was that I was a little bit of a sort of geeky teenager, and I realized that my international career in rugby was not likely to happen due to the fact that I hated rugby. And then I had a problem, well, you know, suddenly I realized that there were girls around, and what were they going to do? And I came up with this cunning plan that could not fail, which was all I had to do was become a pop star, and my problems would be over. They would beat a path to my door. The first problem in this was that the relevant instrument at the time was something some of you may recall called a fairlight, which was what was called a sampler. It could listen to sound, and then you could play it on the keyboard. And the big problem with a fairlight was that in the money back then, it cost £100,000. So I pretty soon calculated that this was going to take 4,000 years for me to get one of these. And so, with the wonderful naivety of youth, I set about building a fairlight. And the nearest thing I could get was a BBC Micro. And after all sorts of wonderful work, I managed to build a D to A converter out of resistors and nothing else. And what I could do is write a program, and it could output a waveform, and it could make sound. And it was truly awesome, apart from one thing, which is about every 200 milliseconds, there was an interrupt that hit the processor to go and do something else. And so my lovely waveform would stop. There'd be a horrible noise, and then it would carry on. And the level of sophistication of understanding I had of the software world back then was shown by the fact that my solution to this was to cut the interrupt line on the motherboard. And there it was, I was away. So sadly, this plan didn't seem to work in its original objective, but what I did end up doing was the first commercial thing I started doing, which was while I was still an undergraduate, was designing synthesizers. And this was the 80s. Many of you will remember the great hits of the 80s. And ended up building these things. And the art was moving very fast. And pretty soon, they were probably the most powerful and advanced real-time computational devices on the planet, because they had digital signal processing chips to actually deal with all the audio samples in real time, and then processors to do with the keys. And they were incredibly difficult real-time programming problems, because, of course, the musician could stand up there and they could walk up to the keyboard and they could do an Elton John, you know, glissando all the way down. And then the sound would come about 30 seconds later because the processor was overloaded. So you learnt a lot, and I started to learn all sorts of interesting things that served me well in my future career. The first one was to do the prototypes, I needed to get hold of digital signal processing chips to do the processing. Now, these things were designed to go in the front end of missiles. So the problem was, if you rang up the companies that made them and you said, you know, could you please send me a sample, they would want to know what the delivery system was. So I rang them up, and I sort of fudged it a bit, and eventually I got sent one of these through the post. It was wonderful. And it got sent to my then college flat, which was Devonshire Road, opposite the railway lines, nice decaying Victorian college flat. All was going well until one morning the doorbell rang at about 11. So I got out of bed and put on my dressing gown, and I went downstairs, and there was a delegation from the makers of the chip looking for Mr. Michael Lynch. And luckily, despite the night before, never heard of him. I have no idea where he is. And they went away. The other fascinating thing, for those of you of that era will remember, was so we were designing hardware, and then we were using compilers, and we were writing code. And at the risk of sounding like you young people don't know how lucky you are, back then, the hardware couldn't be relied on to actually do what the chip design said it did. You designed a piece of hardware, so you may have made some mistakes, but the great one was the compilers didn't work. So the actual compiled code didn't reflect what the compiler said it would do on the tin. So actually, problem solving was very difficult. And what you had to do is you became very probabilistic in your approach to problem solving. So for the hardware problems, the most powerful method of analysis was to lick your finger and run it along the side of the chips. And the extra sort of capacitive resistive load on the signals, if they're anywhere close, would knock them out and the thing would crash and you'd find what was wrong. With the compiler, you had to write your code in a very defensive way because you didn't know what the compiler was going to do. And so what you ended up doing was developing a very interesting sort of skill set of assuming nothing. And that's turned out to be very useful when it comes to working with very advanced technologies. There is two legacies of those days. The first one is my college flat. I happened to meet a graduate who was living in it about 4 years ago, and I explained that we had been building all these synthesizers in there, and he said to me, "So that's why there's solder in the carpet." And I realized how often the college must actually change the carpet in those. And the other thing was slightly sadder was, I spent large amounts of time designing and programming these things, and I went onto the App Store, and there is now a sequencer with digital instruments in it, which is free on the iPhone, that does more than those systems did. And that really is the statement of the rate of change of technology that we see. So, what was it like in those early days? Well, the wonderful thing that I had as an advantage was that I didn't actually know anything about business. And I didn't have an MBA or anything like that. And so I learned from first principles. And I think that actually is a big advantage in technology, because so much of what you're told in the business world is about how things should be done. But when technology is moving so fast, things are changing all the time, and it's much better to go back to first principles. The second wonderful thing about naivety is that you don't know that things are impossible. So the big change from back then is we would decide to go and do something, and we would just launch into it. And now, I work with my colleagues that I've worked with for 15 years, and someone comes in with an idea and they can give you 20 reasons why it won't work, straight off. And they're all valid, and it's all great. And of course, the reality is you never start the idea. And what really has to happen is there has to be an ability to give ideas space to just grow and develop a little bit before they get killed off. And it's a very difficult balance between using your knowledge of the world and all problems and allowing space to start to do the impossible. And if you can do that, then you can make things happen. So we set up the business. The biggest problem we have is that to get premises, we have to sign up to a 3-year lease, but we don't have any money, and we don't have any credit references or anything like that. And here, actually, the university played a fascinatingly important role, which is St. John's had created what it called the St. John's Innovation Centre. And the catalyst here was something really very simple, which was you could sign up for 1 month. And that meant that there was no risk. You could also grow the business. And so we moved in. We could only afford a room that was designed for 1 person and a desk. And so the problem was when the very nice director of the Innovation Centre used to walk past, and there were 8 people in there, he sort of, would look round the corner and he'd say, you're not all here, are you? No, they're just visiting. And that way, the combination of us, him, and the insurance policy somehow managed to fit together. One of the big problems we had in the early days, though, was being so small, people would come to visit us. And they'd love what we were doing, but they'd see the size of the company and they wouldn't work with us. We were too small. But we were saved by one thing, which is in the room, there was a broom cupboard. And so, of course, what we did was we put a notice on the door that said, authorized personnel only beyond this point. When people would visit, we'd say, we'd love to show you all the engineers, but, they do stuff for the government, so you'd have to send your passport. And it worked wonderfully. And of course, it was a tradition then in the company. From then on, we would have such signs, and some of them would have 500 engineers behind them, and some of them would have mops, and you could never quite tell. And we got one of our big breaks, actually, which was quite interesting in that we had a visit from a sales guy IT sales guy for Oracle, which was a very thrusting, big American software company. And he had a big deal to the police, selling them all sorts of things. And he was worried he was going to lose it to IBM because he didn't have a fingerprint matching machine. And he turned up to us and he said, could you make a fingerprint matching machine? And we went, oh, yes, absolutely. And then I remember we basically didn't sleep for about 5 weeks whilst we learned, first of all, what fingerprints were, which was a good starting point, and then how to create a machine. And we did. And we took it up, and it was South Yorkshire Police. And normally in business, the big problem with being a small company is that no one will work with you. But we met what's a crucial thing in a small company's life, which is the champion. It's a person who breaks the rules for the good of the organisation. And this was the then head of CID in South Yorkshire. And he was a Yorkshireman, he'd been in the force for many years. And at that time, South Yorkshire was going through a rebranding. So there were mission statements everywhere about what the police force was all about. And he used to, as I walked down the corridor with this chap, the head of CID, he'd just look at this stuff and he'd say, my mission is catching criminals. And so we showed him a machine that could help him catch criminals. And at that point, he cut through all of the formality and bought one. It did wonderful things in South Yorkshire. They went from being able to search one fingerprint every 3 weeks with 20 people to getting results in 2 minutes. And it completely changed what they were doing. And then we went on from that, and Autonomy spun out of that business as we started dealing with information, because we realized then that computers were going to have to deal with information in a human-friendly form, like prose and video and audio. And that was very rapidly very successful. We initially thought we were going to do a consumer product. So we had, our first product was actually a little dog that scampered around your PC and went like this when it found something and stuff appeared. The problem was that at this point, internet software went free, which completely destroyed the business model. But one of the things we did that was very important is we were prepared to change the plan. And we worked out that companies had money and they paid for things, and so we shifted over to being in the enterprise, and that worked very well. And Autonomy grew, and we learned a lot as we went along. Initially, we went public onto ESDAC, which was the European attempt at a market like America's NASDAQ. And that was important because the stock exchange rules were so far out of date then in the UK that it was almost impossible to list a new technology business. You had to have 3 years profitable trading and all sorts of other constraints. And ESDAC gave us a route to actually listing the business, and it moved forward and it grew and became a very large, successful business. So, what did we learn? Well, a couple of things. The first one is focus. One of the things that's very sad when you sort of hear people talking about how to do a technology business, and you'll hear the accountants will turn up and the lawyers will turn up and there'll be some sort of panel and everything, is the long, long list of things you're supposed to do. And the good news is ignore all but the first 5, because they're the only ones that matter. And really getting focused into what it is you need to achieve. So, wake up each day, work out what it is are the 5 things to get done, and get them done. And that's what makes all the difference. And one of the things that you see quite often in the US is that you'll see some startup, and you'll read that Valley venture capitalists have invested 100 million in this business. You can just write that business off at that point. And the simple reason is it's almost impossible to have focus when you've got 100 million to burn, because you're off, you're going to do all these wonderful things. And actually, the one thing that is a real constraint in a technology business is time. Whatever you're doing is a perishable item. So focus is actually really about making sure that you're getting on with what you need to do. The next one is a very important point for Cambridge companies, which is the importance of marketing. The number of times I meet small Cambridge companies and there's this sort of concept that marketing is cheating. Somehow, if you have the best product, it's all going to be fine. And the reality is when you look at any of the great companies, whether they be here or in Silicon Valley, they nearly always have both. They have great technology and they have great marketing. And you really mustn't underestimate the importance of telling the story. You know, that is about positioning, it's about thinking about how you explain things, how you put them in simple terms, how you give people the one idea to deal with. And I learned this one the hard way, in that very early on in autonomous history, we were trying to raise some money, and I ended up getting an introduction to a man who was described as a billionaire in the video industry in New York. Now, I was too naive to work out what that meant at the time, and I turned up at his office, and he had his office in New York. It was very nice, and as I'm walking in, I see some of his products on the shelves, and I worked out the exact line of videos that he was working in. And anyway, I'm there, so I sit down, and I'm opposite him, and he's, you know, absolute sort of cliche, hard-headed New Yorker, and he has a model of his jet, which is strategically placed right in your eye line between you and him, just in case you were going to miss it. It's there. And I explained to him that I had this wonderful new system that, you know, decomposed text and used singular value decomposition to make the computation more efficient. And the guy just looked at me like I was crazy. And his accountant, who was called Saul, was there with a big cigar. And after a lot of struggling and confusion, Saul just turned to Joe and he said, "It works like the human brain." And at that point, every sinew in my body tensed. No one knows how the human brain works. No one can understand the magic of that organ. We can't even begin to describe that. And I answered, yes, it's just like the human brain. And on that basis, he offered to put £25 million into the business, which luckily we used to go and get someone else to put £25 million in the business, but it was very crucial to have that offer on the table. Other important things to think about are, this is the hungry wolf. And the hungry wolf is a mighty and truly wondrous predator. But every so often, times are hard, and the hungry wolf will even go and eat lichen off rocks. And the important point here is that no matter what the grand plan is, no matter what you started doing, sometimes you have to go and do something else. And one of the model failures that you see is where you have venture capitalists. The venture capitalist has invested in a company on the basis of a plan. I've almost never seen a company end up doing what it started to do. So what you have to be in a position to do is change that plan. And that means getting the kind of investor that can be confident enough to sit down again and think about what's been learned and what's happened. And so the hungry wolf does something slightly different to what it thinks is its prime goal, and it lives to fight another day, and it learns and it moves forward. This one is the most crucial one. Very simple. Always take a gun to a knife fight. And what this means is, if you have a great technology, program, idea, there is such a lag for getting that to market, and the incumbents have such an advantage in terms of distribution and brand and marketing and relationships that don't even do it unless you have an absolutely unfair advantage. And so one of the things that I see a lot of is you'll see amazing people that are very bright that you would immediately back. And what they're doing is, we have a new great version that's better than Facebook. Or, you know, the analogy that's used in the venture capital world is, we have a sort of dark brown fizzy sugar drink. Well, Coca-Cola's done it, it's done. So the important point here is, before you do something, start with a real unfair advantage, because it gets eroded through the process, and it makes it so much easier when you have that unfair advantage to actually jump above everyone else. And then the last one is an interesting one. The natural instinct of people when they're discussing a new technology is to define it in terms of what people understand. So this is, don't get drawn into his kind of fight. So a very simple example would be, you could argue that autonomy was a search engine, You could argue that Google was a search engine. A very simple way of marketing autonomy would have been to say it's like Google but cleverer. But the point is you're then fighting on the definition, which is the other party's definition. So in that case, it would be about typing keywords into a box. It's much better to create your own definition, and then you own that and you win that. And again, it's one of the things you see from small Cambridge companies is you walk in and they'll tell you why they are better than a universe around them in those terms. Very, very important to create your own thing that you own and move forward. What about actually running the businesses? Well, this dates back to my youth when televisions used to have two knobs on the back, contrast and brightness. And this is really about how you create a culture inside a business that can deliver things that are very, very impressive and move fast enough to beat the big boys with all of their advantages. And what I'm talking about here is you see lots of people that talk about being very positive in the workplace, and I call that brightness. And you can turn up brightness and you can have a very positive workplace, and that's a good thing. But the second measure is the most important, which is contrast. And what you need to be prepared to do is when people do amazing things and they deliver amazing work, and it's not just technical, whatever they're doing, whether it's a receptionist or salesperson or someone technical, you need to be prepared to acknowledge that at an extreme level. So, you know, the fact that so many British companies won't give share options to their staff is awful. But there's another side to the equation, which people don't usually like to talk about, which is if you have a member of staff in a small company who really isn't making any effort and has no interest in being there, deal with it. Because A, they'll be much happier in a different environment, but B, you'll open up a slot for someone that really wants to have the chance to be in something and do something and make something happen. So the important lesson here is, although everyone always talks about turning up the brightness, it's also important to turn up the contrast to get that culture. Now, one of the interesting things about me is I'm actually deaf. I lip read. And this has brought me great benefit in two aspects of management. The first one is, in my early days, someone would say that they'd done something, and just because I hadn't really heard them, I'd look sort of slightly quizzical and unimpressed. And they'd then go away and they'd make it even better. And so very important when you have wonderfully bright people to realize that sometimes you have to look slightly unimpressed and they'll come back and they'll do something even better. And that's amazing. Let's talk about the second example, and that's vision. Now, so vision is an important part of technology marketing. You know, what is it that you're doing? Where's it going? What does it stand for? And there's two parts to this. There's the perception of that, but actually, as I've learned recently, it's actually really important that there really is a vision as well. Otherwise, it's very hard to see proper leadership in a business. Now, the way I got onto vision was simple, in that one of the nightmare scenarios for me in this situation, being deaf, is that someone back there asks a question in a quiet voice. And when you don't hear things very well, what you have to do is interpolate and guess the question, very like the science of speech recognition for machines. And of course, the problem is, what this first means is that you stand there and you're desperately trying to work out why they have just said that the zebra should be let out later. And you're looking into the corner of the room and you're pausing. And what I discovered is that whenever you're asked a question in technology and you look in the corner of the room and you pause, and then you come out with a completely unconnected answer, people think you're a genius. And that is the definition of being a visionary. So, what about when it goes wrong? Well, Andy Grove, I think, has the famous saying, only the paranoid survive. And the important thing about technology is, the reason why technology is wonderful to work in is that opportunity is always coming up. And by definition, incumbents are always being displaced. And so what you continually have to be doing is thinking about where the threat is coming from, where the change is, how things are going to completely turn over. You know, you can be there doing PCs, tablets appear. Now, if you're a PC manufacturer these days, there are contract design houses that you can go out and get a design. There are contract manufacturers, and you turn the handle and you're in the business. When Apple comes out with an iPad, though, the technology in that is so advanced by comparison with PC, you can't just catch up on the spot with that. That's a dislocative change. When you see people who are in the hardware business getting your data through iCloud or Facebook or iTunes, that's a dislocative thing because, you know, if I wanted to swap my iPhone for something now, there's the problem of my music collection. So the whole game is changing all the time, and understanding how those positions in the value chain are moving about is absolutely crucial. Talk a little bit about international. One of the big disadvantages of doing technology out of the UK, of course, is that we have a relatively small market. If you do it out of the US, you start with a market of 300 million. Here, it's much smaller. And although we have the EU, the problem is that people speak different languages, there are much stronger cultural differences, it's much more difficult to scale out into that. There is an advantage, though, which is we're learning in the UK, because of things like the EU, to be much more international in our thinking. So the US model is probably typified by, you know, I'll have friends in the Valley and I'll get this phone call, and it will be someone that I've met somewhere, and they'll say, you know, Mike, I've been put in charge of Europe. I'm going to come over and visit places. What can you tell me about Europe? So one of the advantages I think that UK companies can have is to be a little bit more out there in terms of internationalizing the business sooner. You know, we kind of almost have the disadvantage that we have to do it, but that actually pushes us out there and makes that happen. So that's very important. The other big transition for a technology business is to make it in America. If you're an arm, at the end of the day, it's a global business, and that means you have to make it in America. It's the same with an Autonomy or a CSR or any of these companies. And it is difficult because it's almost like a restart up of the business. You can't do it from here. Someone has to go out there. You can't employ people to do it for you. You know, because there's cultural differences. It's very difficult to interview Americans because they interview incredibly well. You know, your Brit going for a job kind of looks at the table and says, well, I would be quite good at that, I think. Whereas, you know, your American will convince you that you've got to hire this person. So what you have to do is have someone go out there and do it. And the thing that we found was it was very, very hard to be taken seriously initially as a technology provider. And things like Cambridge are incredibly useful. They've heard of Cambridge and they value that. But sometimes what you have to do is play to their approach and their model. And we had, in the early days, our big break in America after failing twice was we ended up getting introduced to a PR maven of the Valley. And these, in those days, these people were the gods of the Valley. They actually were the kingmakers. And she was a bit bored, and she thought it would be a real challenge to get this bunch of Brits some PR in the Valley. And so she sat us down and she used very short words. And she said, right, what you are going to do is the following. And so the next time we had an interview, she basically, we got the question thrown at us, you know, why are you here? And the answer was, we're here because America is a land of opportunity where honest people are not held back by the class system and can rise. And at that point, the journalist is on your side because it's reinforcing the view that they have. And we got some great PR and we got the business started. So, you know, good idea to get those old Stanley Holloway films out called Blimey Governor. The most important part of all of this, though, is the people. You know, the thread that you can trace from the computer lab through its 75 years through into companies and the impact on the UK and the world is all down to the people. And what you have is this amazing cluster of people with know-how. that itself has created the Cambridge cluster, and you have the ability to pull in expertise and know-how and people helping. And what we've got going now is a virtuous circle where, because you have the arms and the autonomies and the CSRs, they're creating people who know not only how to do the technical things, which is what the university has been very good at, but we now have people who know how to do the marketing and the selling, and they're available, so they leave those companies, they join new young companies, and you get a virtuous circle going in terms of that know-how. One important point here, though, for the government, which is the power of these clusters mustn't be underestimated. So one of the things that's very sad, and it's sort of stopped recently, but when you would hear that regional development authorities, every Welsh valley was going to have its own nanotechnology centre. Completely misguided approach. It's a bit like starting a fire. What you want is where you've got the fire going, you build the fire out from there. You don't go and try and start a completely new one over there. And what this comes down to is, yes, you have to be very careful about planning and how you do things. Cambridge is certainly busy, but what you can start to do is spawn things off, rather than, with the best will in the world, trying to start something somewhere where it's just unnatural for it to start. So using the clusters in the right way, and eventually that value does flow to the rest of the UK, but you have to do it on that one. So let's talk a little bit about the UK and government. The best way to understand this process, because there are many opinions you'll hear about how we get more high technology businesses in the UK, is to think of it as a pipeline. And it's a pipeline where many different stages in the pipeline, and they're different widths. And obviously, if there's a blockage in that pipeline, you don't get anything coming through. Well, the good news is we have now done start-up to world-class a reasonable number of times in the UK. So the pipeline is clear. You can start at one end and come out at the other. So now the question is, where are the narrow bits? Where are the bits, if we could open them up, we get more of these companies coming through? And remember, the educational standard of our top universities is second to none, so we ought to be having more impact. You look at the FTSE 100, there is one software company in the FTSE 100, it's Sage, and I don't think the director of Sage would mind me saying, it's straightforward accounting software. This is not, changing the world's stuff. This is a big problem for the UK, because we have, if you like, if this was a natural resources argument, we're sitting on gold in terms of the university output, and we're not converting it to the economic impact that it should. Where are the problems? Well, getting very early stage funding is still a big problem. And in Cambridge, we're blessed by having angels. And we have the Cambridge Angels, and they're wonderful, and there's lots of them that really know what they're doing. The problem is we need far more of them. If you you look at the US, for the size of the economy, the number of angels is a multiple of the UK. And this is a pyramid, and the base of the pyramid is what sets the height of the top. So we've got issues there. We've got various stages in the VC process that it is not rational for VCs to put perhaps $2 million into a company when they can go and put 200 million into one, and for the same amount of work get a much larger return. So we need to look at some of those problems. Government procurement. It is a massive driver of how things are done in the US. So for example, big government contract is given to a large-scale provider, because those are the people that, for some reason, people have confidence in doing this stuff. But it's mandated that a certain amount of that value has to go to small companies. Government gets a great deal, because the small companies produce the most powerful stuff. But what you get is the ability to leverage that procurement money into references and funding. And that's incredibly powerful. We need to be thinking about that sort of thing more. Capital markets in the UK have big problems. Many venture capitalists will not list onto the capital markets in the UK. What that means is that they get to a decision when the businesses are value around 80 to 100 million, where they have two choices. They either sell out, and that's what's generally been happening, and we've seen some Cambridge examples of this recently, where companies I would love to have seen run to $1 billion have been sold out at that level. Or you have to head down and go up to 600 million before you can take it to NASDAQ. We need to fix that hole so that we don't just create great R&D labs, which we then ship off to overseas acquirers. Issues around immigration and visas. Very controversial political debate around Polish plumbers and all this sort of stuff. But if you actually look at what powers Silicon Valley, it's its ability to draw in the ultra-skilled, the very best from around the world, and they start businesses which employ a lot of local people and create value. The UK is an attractive place for people to come. We need to capitalize on that. We need to separate the debate around the ultra-skilled people. And then there are many issues around things like IPR and how that's transferred, and universities and things like that that people need to work with. So this is the area that I'm very focused on at the moment. As a byproduct of the acquisition of Autonomy by HP, a lot of the Autonomy people are now out of Autonomy and doing wonderful things, and they have their skill set available, and looking at ways of making sure that there's now funding available for companies so that they can go all the way through that. And that's the exciting new world that I see. So what I wanted to do was just finish a little bit talking about technology. As Mr. Bishop says from Microsoft Research, we need to embrace uncertainty. And the interesting thing about this idea is it's almost the polar opposite of the previous lecture. Because what we're saying, or what I'm saying is, when we started thinking about using computers in the late 60s, the world was too complicated and too difficult for the computers to have any hope of understanding. So what we did was we took abstractions of those problems. For example, we could calculate a payroll, and we created definitions, and they were very defined, and then we had simple rules that related how we added up the payroll. And that was wonderful. We could automate a whole series of tasks that are going on. And we would get an answer that we would understand. The problem is that the real world has moved on, and the type of information we're dealing with now is no longer that accurate. If we want to recognize speech, we can't prove that we're going to get the right answer, at least not in any practical sense. But what we want is, can we get an answer that's as good as a human can get? And this is because of the variation in the real world all around us for these sort of things. So, to use an analogy here, the formal rule-based approach gives you these concepts of provability that many of us are familiar with. But when you go out to try and do real-world image recognition or visual recognition or extracting meaning from documents, you'll forgive me a sort of slightly flippant answer, it's a bit like trying to draw your equilateral triangles on a wonky table where your piece of string is actually elastic and the pencil has an arbitrary width. And so the reality of getting a usable answer comes down to accepting that there is not a perfect answer. And so that takes you into the realm of probability. So if you're prepared to say your speech recognizer isn't going to get it right all the time, can you actually get better results overall? And I was once thinking about this, and the analogy is, can I prove that I can walk across the room? Well, actually, I know from experiences on various Saturday nights there are counter cases to this. But it doesn't matter. I can take a probabilistic approach to that. So what, I think a lot of work that's going on in the commercial application of some of the changes in computing is about really understanding this embracing of the uncertain. Many of you know that I tend to work with Bayesian methods. You have Reverend Thomas Bayes on the left there, who the theorem is named after. There could be other characters that could really also claim the invention. And on the right you have Claude Shannon. And these are the areas like machine learning, data-driven understanding of problems, probabilistic analysis. And some of these things are very philosophical. So if you look at some of the really advanced work in computer security now, in the academic world, it's made some transitions in there. So if you go into the commercial world, the IT industry is telling you have to put a lock on every door and every window, and that's how you're going to make the whole thing secure. Well, the reality is you go into a large company now and the staff are sending all the documents via Dropbox because it's so much easier than going undoing all the locks. So you've gone backwards. And the difference here is if you take a probabilistic approach, it's a bit like securing the Olympics from a terrorist attack. If you were taking the computer IT security approach from the commercial world at the moment, you would have a metal detector at the bottom of the M1. Everyone would have to drive down, there'd be a queue, you'd get out, you put all your stuff in a plastic thing, you'd go through it, and eventually you'd be allowed into London. Okay? Just unworkable. So models which are more about accepting that you don't get a perfect result, but you get practically the best result you can, are going to become very important, I think, as we go forward. So we have that change going on, which I think is fundamental, and many of you in the academic world are very familiar with this, but it's a big change now in the commercial application area. And then what do we see going on in the world? Well, the amount of processing power in a smartphone is doubling every 6 months at the moment. It's phenomenal. It's what I would have called, when I was doing my PhD, a supercomputer. And that's just going to continue happening. And so what we've got now is the ability to run algorithms which really go up a level. Rather than dealing with keywords, they deal with what something means. Rather than just storing an image, they can actually understand to some extent what's in it. Speech recognition, it isn't just about producing a transcript of what was said, but is actually coming back with an answer or helping you. These are fundamental changes, and it's about moving into the world of human-friendly information. And what we're seeing is connectivity, so that, for example, these understandings and processing can be in the cloud, so that we can share the knowledge that's created. We've got processing power, we've got sensors, we've got devices, we've got always on. And then we've got big changes about information. Information is shown in a textual form. It's only really been disseminated in that form since the printing press was created. In the history of the evolution of our brains, that's a blink. What about using information, interacting it in the same way that you interact with the real world, like its objects? And these are areas like augmented reality, where rather than seeing something, typing something in, it's recognized, and then we interact with the information as though it's an object. What all of this means is that we are right at the beginning of the changes. The abilities in algorithms, the ability in processing, the ability in systems, the ability in connectivity, devices, means that the possibilities now are really exploding. And what we've actually seen up to now is, in effect, the pre-internet. It's a first stage situation. But now that the machines are starting to, at some level, extract meaning and understanding, then the ability to do things with very large amounts of information completely changes. So with that, it's the beginning, but for me, it's the end. So thank you very much.
Okay, folks, so let's take some questions from Mike, and then we'll move on to panel. We have a roving Mike, and it's Rory over there.
Mike, you talked interestingly about the sort of conditions we need for innovation in the UK. There's been an awful lot of stress from the government on London, Tech City. Do you think they've slightly taken their eye off the ball of what we've got here in Cambridge in terms of real technology and real links between university and business?
No, because I think you've got two types of technology. What Cambridge is very good at is what I would call fundamental technology. So the kind of things you're seeing in the posters out here, there's, to use a very simple phrase, real science in them. What Tech City tends to be about is the other side of what the UK is good at, which is the creative industries. So it tends to be a little bit more advertising, social media, and don't knock that. The UK is very, very good at that. The reason we rule the world with Strictly, which we export to so many countries. So I don't think there's anything wrong in saying that that is a technology-heavy sector, but it's not about fundamental science. Cambridge is about fundamental science, but we're not going to be creating the next great, online TV show here. Now, the real power comes when the train from Cambridge stops such that you can get really quickly from Cambridge to Tech City. So what you actually can do is bring those two together. So if you get the kind of work going on here being used to power the kind of thinking that those people are doing out there, then you've got a real win-win. So, there are some little things about it. So I don't think there's anything about missing the point. I think Cambridge, is here to stay. It's done it. The pipeline's unblocked. We need to make that happen more. Tech City is about using an adjacency to the fact that the UK is so good at creative industries and advertising. If we can get the two talking, then we could really start to do some of the really interesting things in the near future.
Mike, thanks for a great talk. Back to the whole issue of the impact of research in the economy and the acceleration of research for the benefit of the economy. If there's one thing that you could do or you could advise government to do to remove some of those blockages, what would be top of your list?
It's interesting because I spend a lot of time thinking about that and talking to people, and actually I'm not sure what the solution is. The most important single point at the moment is STEM education at high school level. And it's a very difficult problem because you've got to get the teachers and move forward from that way. But we're in a situation at the moment where the output of our universities at the top level is very, very good. Then you fall off quite quickly. We're not going to keep that top level if we allow things like maths attainment to start to fall too far on physics. And we're going to have a problem that we don't have a hinterland of people that are the next level down. Massive issue, the number of girls doing A-level physics, It's such a waste. So, ironically, it's not about venture capital, it's not about all those things, it's about STEM education, and it's about changing an approach to that. I think it's true to say that Scotland is the fastest falling mathematics high school attainment country in one of the tables I was looking at recently. Interestingly enough, number one is South Korea. And we have to be really on the ball on dealing with that.
Thank you for your talk. What I personally feel is one of the biggest issues at the moment for commercialization of technology is the lack of communication between industry and academia specifically. We have big drivers like industry, however all the R&D and knowledge is in academia, and the thing is there's a bridge that's actually not connecting both sides, as you just mentioned, between London and Cambridge. My background is in nanotechnology. I work in high-density data storage, and what I've seen around when I look at nanotechnology right now with other countries like America, for example, you have these incubation centers which provide the communication right there, provides the funding from start to finish, from prototype to end product, where a startup is formed and you have licensing opportunities and you can start selling products as well. Do you think that's something that is something that UK needs to really push towards, seeing that it's a nation that's possibly the smartest one, or in the top 3 around the world with a fantastic R&D portfolio?
Yeah, I think it's one of these areas you need to be very careful. I think there are specific issues in each country. So if you go back to when I was starting off, there was a large amount of the university hierarchy that thought that a university touching anything to do with industry was a bad thing. Through various governments' policies now, the universities are well aware that technology transfer is an important metric of their performance. And whatever you might think about that, it has the effect of meaning that there's a much more active process there. There are also other problems. We tend to, in the UK, quite often managers will not have a scientific background in the same way as other places. That makes it difficult. There are issues about IPR. So, you know, if you're a corporate trying to work with a university, you know, how are you happy that the work you do doesn't get sort of eventually derailed by some IPR clause? If you're a university, you know, should you be giving away your IPR? Now, there are very different views on this. Some people think a volume model where you just say to the universities, get it out there, have impact. Other people want very tight control of the IPR. So coming back to your question, I think that the incubator idea is a little bit simple. I think there are more specific issues you need to deal with, and if you could get those done. Another very simple example I have is I get invited to the Judge Institute, right, opposite the engineering department, and I go in and there'll be the entrepreneur class, and there'll be lots of people doing MBAs, and they're all going to be entrepreneurs, and they come up and they all pitch their idea. And with a few exceptions, I don't tend to get very excited, okay? And then you'll walk around the computer lab or the engineering department and you'll see something and your jaw will drop. And you sort of say, well, you know, why don't you go and do this? And the simple solution to this is to take the first group of people and lock them in a room with the second group of people. And they're only allowed to come out too, because, you know, the people that have all this ambition and think they want to run a business but don't have the idea, and then we have amazing ideas here with people who are busy with the ideas. It's these kind of things that you've got to get moving.
Okay, so we're moving to the innovation panel. I'll take two more, Richard, and then finally Alec, and then we'll move, and you'll have plenty of chance to ask more questions. So Richard first, and then Alex.
Richard Sibbs. From the earliest days of the Cambridge phenomenon, some of the most successful Cambridge companies have been sold to the Americans. Has this been good or bad for the British economy?
It's a very complex question to answer because of itself, it doesn't need to be a bad thing. The problems are, is there a differentiation? Is there a differential valuation problem? So if it was the free market argument here is, should be a free market. You don't want protectionism. There'll be a trading of ideas. That's the way to move forward. The counter argument says that you haven't got a free market because there's a differential generally in valuation between what the UK market will pay for a piece of technology and what the US market pays for technology. What that means is there's an inherent acquisition bias to technology leaving the UK. So that's the first question you've got. So another example of a bias is, if I want to go and acquire an American software company, it's probably got a poison pill, which means that I can't just go and buy it. Those are illegal on the UK market, so an American company can just come here and make an offer and buy it. So you haven't got symmetry, which is one of the issues around the free market argument. The second thing is IPR. You know, that's two levels. Practical level is, if you have a great company like we had recently in Cambridge and it gets taken out by a US player early, fine, the VCs clean up on their 80 million, but the center of that moves to the US and the value creation is there. If you have, and I'm not saying this is happening in any way at all, but if you have a company the size of Arm acquired, it's too big really to move, so it doesn't matter in the same way. So we've got to be very careful about these smaller companies where we in fact do the R&D and then the value creation is in the US. I think it is an area where we do have a problem. One of the solutions is to get more of these companies happening in the UK so that we get a investor base that is more familiar with valuing technology on the American models. Then you wouldn't have the differential, then you would have a sort of standard situation. We could talk a long time about that.
Well, we might get onto that. So final question from Alec.
Mike, the large question, the question we're wrestling with a lot down in Westminster, we just had a debate yesterday whether the Select Committee of Science and Technology could look at this one, is the big statistical difference. We spend 1.7% of our GDP on R&D. Our competitors spend between 2.5% and 3%. Now, when you're in Cambridge, that's difficult to see. I mean, everything's so live, and in many ways in London it's so live. But this means that in this country, we're underspending about 12 billion dollars that we're not spending on R&D. It's mainly in industry. It's not a university problem. Do you observe that? Is there
Well,
a solution
it's actually worse than the figures you're giving, because the way that R&D is defined in the UK includes innovative services models. So you can get companies that have really got nothing to do with R&D claiming R&D credits. So, you know, one argument says that the Treasury should just tighten that up. So you stop paying things that have really got nothing to do with R&D credits, and use the money that you get back to create a headline number, which is a real standout number, which then means that overseas companies will spend R&D dollars here because they're getting an even better model. So it's definitely an area that needs a lot of looking at and tightening up. And then the other thing is industry is not making the same decisions about R&D spend that you see in other countries, but that again is coming back to the fact of the way in which the capital markets here value longer term cash flows, which is the differential between how you're valuing US tech and so in a sense we've got to make sure the capital markets are functioning in a way which supports these new high growth longer term businesses rather than the traditional ones that we've been there. You know, all of this comes back to the simple fact that we have SAGE in the FTSE 100. That's a national problem. We've got to change that. We need 5 software companies in the FTSE 100. We want a couple of hardware ones. Otherwise, we've got a big issue here.
Okay, well, Mike, so we have prepared a little thing for you as well. So could I present you with a certificate to commemorate your fantastic lecture? And it's a real pleasure to have somebody with your experience. My God, does this guy know his stuff? And then also, of course, a book that everybody has now bought.
Available in the lobby.
Available in the lobby. This one's with sticker as a special thing.
Do I get the gold star?
Yeah, you get the gold star. Thank you very much.